I am Jason, Prince of Mediocre Terrain and Defender of Halloween-themed terrain. So hello and welcome to Terrain Made Easy. I'm going to be making a skeleton cave entrance, probably for like D&D or fantasy games. That's the final product, but obviously I'll show you how we made that. And we'll do that right now. A little bit of a problem with the first footage here. I actually didn't press record on the camera whilst I was streaming, and therefore the footage we're looking at is footage that I have downloaded from YouTube of my own stream. On Tuesday nights I do some streaming. I normally either talk about terrain topics or actually make terrain. Thankfully I was making this one on stream. So all I did is I took my skull, which is a £3 skull from Wilko's in the UK, and it sort of had like a movable jaw, right? So I just took off the jaw, obviously first and foremost, and I only really wanted like the bottom part of the bottom teeth. So what I did, and this took a bit of a while, is I got my little, I forgot what it's called, the razor saw, the little hobby saw, and I chopped off like the back of the bottom jaw, so it was literally just the front part of the teeth. And then I was like, if I put that on the board as it is, it'll be very high and I'd have to have quite a few steps so you could get through the mouth, and I didn't really want that, so I took to sawing through it to reduce the height of the teeth like that. And that took quite a while. In fact, just sawing through this plastic took quite a while. People were like, why don't you buy a Dremel? Jay, you should have a Dremel. And I probably should have a Dremel, but I don't have one, and I don't really like using specialised tools too much. The hobby saw is quite cheap and, to be fair, quite versatile, so I do recommend getting one if you can. So once I've sawed through my teeth and I'm left with just the bottom part of my teeth, what I actually want is like the ground and then a step, and then you go through the teeth into the cave. And for that I'm obviously going to need a base for this big piece of terrain. I'm using 3mm EPVC or Foamex. It's like a plastic. It's nice and soft so you can cut through it with a blade. I estimated the size of it. Probably should have gone a little bit bigger, having now seen the final product, but you know, I didn't. And I beveled the edges on that straight away because I might as well. We'll get rid of my face now as we actually move on to, you know, proper footage. And then I'm all for making like the first step. So what I did is I got my teeth, which sounds weird, but I got the teeth and I just traced it around some, I think it's 10mm foam. Now I've bought the 10mm foam, therefore the texture on it is the one that comes from a factory. If you do have a hot wire cutter, it is actually better to cut the foam yourself with a hot wire cutter, therefore having no sort of texture on it. Then later on you can imprint your own texture. And then what I do again is I trace the teeth onto this 12mm bit of foam, and the reason that's good is because it sort of feels less of like a giant step just to get over the teeth. It feels like you're actually getting into the cave. Cut that out, and then that is the effect that I want. And then in the cave I sort of then want it to look like you're going down into the cave, because I'm not going to have this entrance to a cave be like a massive mountain, because that would be a bit difficult to do. So what I do is I just get a rectangular bit of foam and place that behind the tooth, or the teeth, or whatever you want to call it. And then obviously the next drop down will be to the actual terrain base. And then for the top part of the skull, what I'm actually going to do is to just get some like large bits of XPS foam. This is sort of, I think this is 30mm thick. I use a lot of XPS foam in this build, so if you don't have access to that and you wanted to replicate this, you would be a little bit naffed. But in the UK you can get the skull from Wilko's, and the foam is all off eBay. I'll try and get links if people need it. But all I do is I'm basically creating like a pseudo gap in the middle of the cave, and then I'm going to have like walls around it, so it's in sort of like a U shape going up, and then I'm going to glue the skull onto that. And therefore we'll have like a look where the skeleton, the skull face its mouth is wide, and that's the entrance to the cave like this. But the sides of the walls are still in place. So all I keep doing is I just keep wedging in bits of foam to make it look like it's the right sort of height and get it so that it all balances nicely and there's no like wobbling. And then I start gluing everything in place. I start with the front step, then the teeth, then the inside, and so forth. I just glue everything in place. And then I had one of those moments where, if you make terrain, you've probably done this before, I was unhappy with something. And what I was unhappy with, and I'm not sure if the video will show it, the teeth, the bottom teeth and the top of the skull, the way that I had glued it wasn't perfectly aligned. It sort of looked like one of the teeth were like I can't do it with my jaw, but you know what I mean, slightly to one side. Probably not noticeable to most people, but I ummed and ahed, and I was like, that's going to bug me if I leave it, so I'm going to fix it now before I do anything else. Now, I could have removed the top part of the skull, but I already had it all wedged in place nicely, and I wasn't happy to do that because it was actually quite difficult to get it to glue in place, and I'd used a lot of hot glue to like really like firm it all into place. So I decided to remove the teeth. So I just got a blade and I just cut away the hot glue. It's not a nice effect, but it's passable, and I just redid the exact same steps basically. Right at the back of the skull, I used some expanded polystyrene, just using the cheap stuff for the stuff you're not going to see. And I realised that before I really started putting on my rocks, which I cut out in a minute, I really needed to texture the inside of the cave. Yes, you could actually spray it and get like that melted foam look, but I really just wanted to texture the inside of it. So all I did, even though the skull was in place and it was a little bit difficult, was to just take my blade and essentially like attack it. So I just scraped it, cut it, just making it look like random jagged edges. You're not going to see this very much because it's all going to be dark. But I did that in places where I thought, oh, you might actually be visible. So I just textured it up there. And then the next process is relatively simple, but a lot of foam is going to get used and it's going to take time. And what I'm going to do is cut out large rocks or boulders of XPS foam. Now, for those of you who've seen my Necron crystal video, it's essentially the same kind of method. I'm going to cut out rectangles of different size foam. So I use a 50mm foam, but a 30mm would have been fine as well. I sort of used a combination of the two. I did use my hot wire cutter just to speed this process up a little bit of cutting the 50mm foam. You can cut it with a blade. It will take longer. It's not a precise cut. A lot of people, when they say you can cut them with a blade, it'll take you forever. This probably wouldn't take that long, but I recommend just using the 30mm if you don't have a hot wire cutter because it will take more effort. And all you do, as I said, you get your rectangle and you want to get rid of 90-degree turns or 90-degree edges, because whilst you probably do find some rocks that are naturally like that, it's not common. Therefore, it's probably better to have no 90-degree angles. It would look weird. So the way that you do that, if you start off with a rectangle, is to basically just cut the corners. So you end up with like an 8-sided shape or something like that rather than a 4-sided shape. Be careful, obviously, whenever you're using a sharp blade and you're slicing foam. You do want to try and slice it or saw it if you're having difficulty, like it's a really thick cut, because the cleaner your edge, the nicer these rocks are probably going to look. I'm going for that sort of like clean edge, say, rather than torn. You could, if you wanted, just cut out a rough shape and then pick at it with your finger and get that sort of like dented stone look. You could probably use Woodland Scenics molds, rock molds, if you wanted to do that. There's quite a few ways to do this. What you do need, though, are a lot of these stones, and I mean like a lot. If I counted them, I'd be looking probably at 30, maybe. And I'm going to do right at the very front of the cave, and it looks a little bit like fangs. I'm going to do one large rock at either side. That's sort of like the entrance to the cave. You could do like smaller ones, but I think, you know, it might look a bit weird. I wanted to go with the like one big one at the front on each side, and that's what I do. And then it's just a case of doing these rocks all the way around the skull. And I'm gonna like do more at the front to cover up where it blends in with the step, and the teeth blend in a little bit. I'm all gonna blend that in with little stones or little rocks. But yeah, it's just a case of cut out a giant rock, try and place it in a way that looks natural, hot glue it in place. It'll take a while. It took me quite a while to just do this. Obviously you want to make it so that your rocks don't look like they're randomly overhanging too much, because, you know, then gravity wouldn't keep them in place. You could just go with this being like one giant rock face and therefore not doing these individual boulders, but you know, I wanted this aesthetic and that's what I've gone with. To trim the rocks, I said you just keep trimming away at various angles to get them to be random shapes. It's hard to explain. You just keep slicing until you're happy with it, and then you just glue it in place. Now, I was initially planning on going all the way over the top of the skull, but I ultimately decided I didn't want to do that because the piece was big already and I was only making it bigger and bigger. So I sort of go to just like at the top of the back of the head, but you know, feel free to go all over it if you wanted. Once I did get to the skull part of it with the rocks and the boulders, there was a little system I used to get the stones to look like they were like built into the skull rather than being placed on the skull, because I wanted it to look like the skull was stone. and it had just been chopped away. So what I actually did was I'd make a rock, and then I would cut it in half, and then I would sort of essentially scoop out a circle in the middle, like a semicircle in the middle of the rock, and that would let you place the rock onto like a curved object, and it would look like it fit a little bit better. Now don't worry too much about gaps, because in the next step we're going to fill them in. So just keep going, more and more rocks until you're happy. I mean, there's a lot of rocks there and it takes a little while, but that's what I wanted it to look like. Anything where it did overhang a little bit too much, you know what? I just went in, after I'd hot glued it in place, just went in with a knife and trimmed it down. To actually fill in the gaps, we're going to use my homemade sculptor mold, simply because it's the cheapest option here. You could use actual sculptor mold or Luke PS modelling compound. They are both more than fine for this job and probably technically better, but this is cheaper because all I use is essentially some cheap plaster of Paris. This is some stuff I got off Amazon, and all I do is I mix it up so it's just normal plaster with water. So it's just plaster, water, make it a liquid. I like it to be a little bit runnier than you would if you were going to cast out of this plaster of Paris, because we're going to add in some tissue and the tissue is going to soak up some of that moisture. So you just mix it all together, mix your plaster, and then all I did is I left the plaster to be liquid rather than say like making a big batch of it and letting it dry out. I would just take little bits of tissue, dip it into my plaster, like squeeze it to make sure it's getting to all the nooks and crannies and you're actually having a good mix of your plaster with your toilet paper. And I would literally just went in and filled in the holes and tried to smooth it off with water. Just keep some water that you didn't use for your plaster and it's fine. Now I don't actually here deliberately cover the rocks. You could try and use the plaster for texture. I'm not going to do that. I'm just literally filling in the gaps. I don't necessarily do a great job of filling in all the gaps, but that's what I did. I just went around, put in my little homemade mix and tried to smooth it off. Some of the plaster did get on the rocks, but you know what, I didn't worry about it. And then once the homemade sculptor mold is dried, I'm then going to texture the rocks with some tin foil or aluminium foil or aluminum foil, depending where you're from. All I did is get a big bunch, scrunched it up, and I just, randomly pressed at the rocks, making sure that the texture was visible. If it went over a bit, the plaster didn't get the texture, I didn't bother, it was fine. And then I textured the base with just some PVA, rocks and sand. And then I get some black paint and some Mod Podge. I actually use Mod Podge in this case rather than PVA, but you can use PVA. And then I paint just the rocks and the ground. But I actually used a different brush for the ground, because what I found is once I paint the sand gets on the brush and then I spread it about and it ends up looking ugly. So I paint the rocks with one brush and the sand with another. And then for the actual skull part of it, the plastic skull, what I did was I got a little bit of filler, spackle, joint compound, whatever you want to call it, and I mixed that in with my already existing black paint mixture. And what I'm trying to do there is I'm essentially like trying to thicken up the paint. You can just get a texture with just paint, but I actually wanted the filler in there just to add a bit more volume to it. And all I do is I paint it on first and foremost, and then I essentially just stipple at the paint on the skull. And it's just trying to get a really subtle texture, and it does make quite a big difference. Once I felt the skull, rubbed my hand over it, nice and sensual. When it was the plain plastic, it was nice and smooth, and then after this had all dried, it had sort of like a nice rough texture to it. So for me, I was really happy with that. And then I just overbrush the whole thing in, say, like a dark grey paint, covering like 95% of it, leaving, the recesses grey. Do that for the rocks and the skull. The ground I paint brown. Then I just dry brush it subsequently lighter shades of grey, not 50 shades of grey, lighter shades. Dry brush the ground in a lighter shade of brown. And then I just do a black wash on the whole thing, a relatively minor wash, because I dry brushed it up to like white, and then I'm going to wash it down to sort of back to like a dark grey. I did occasionally mix in a little bit of brown. It's like a browny black wash, but mostly black, just to add a little bit of variance in the colour. And honestly, like the end result of that, I really like. I'm still in two minds whether or not I should dry brush it back up. I really like the dark look. But to finish it off, I put some PVA on the base and put some flock on it, some green flock. add a bit of lichen and stuff like that. And as of recording this very segment, I've not decided I'm going to dry brush it or not, but we'll have a look at some pretty pictures and we'll find out what I've decided. Before we look at the prettier pictures, if you did like this video, then do consider pressing the like button. It really would help. If you're not subscribed to the channel already and you're interested in like terrain overall, then I would be very grateful if you consider doing that. If you want to go the extra mile and support me further, then Patreon is the best place to do so. There will be a link in the description below. Thank you to anybody who considers doing that. Well, let's crack on. So obviously I didn't decide to dry brush it back up, but I still really like the way that it looks. As always, when you make a piece of terrain, there are some imperfections that I haven't highlighted. There's a little bit of a mold line, say like on the teeth, that I didn't notice until I painted it. I sort of wish that I would have removed those first and foremost. There's also a little bit on the actual top part of the teeth where I've left some hot glue without realizing it was there. I do try and cover as much as I can by hiding my mistakes with like lichen and foam and flock and stuff like that. I didn't actually mention in the video, but I did put a little bit of green like moss on some of the rocks. It's weird that, because I don't really like going overboard with that kind of stuff because I'm always worried about ruining it, but ultimately I actually really like the way that it looks. I think it's a perfect kind of piece of terrain for some D&D, or maybe so like on your fantasy board. It's obviously going to block line of sight if you are playing it in a war game, and if you're doing a D&D section, then you can build like your campaign about going into like the skull cave. It's all dramatic and stuff, y'all. Yeah, I'll never be a DM. But it's one of those classic things. I've taken a Halloween skull that would cost £3 from Wilkinson's, or Wilco's. It's weird, if you're in the UK, you almost always refer to it as Wilkinson's, even though it's officially called Wilco. And you can make some decent stuff with it. I sort of think it might have looked good if I would have just taken the face off, like the film, and just had the front bit of it and had the rest of it be rock. But once I realised that I had the whole skull and I sort of couldn't get rid of it very easily because it was taking a long time to saw, then I sort of realised that for the rocks I needed it to just go up to like, relatively the back of the head rather than all the way over the top. When I was picturing this, I was thinking like rocks all the way over the front of it, but ultimately I actually think it looks great, if I'm honest. Like, it didn't take that long, just cutting all the rock stock out a little bit, but ultimately I think it looks pretty decent. I'm filming this the day after because I forgot to say goodbye to you all. Have a most beautiful day, like and subscribe, goodbye.